Welcome to the Railroad Room at the Boone County Heritage Museum. When you come in our front door, the first door to the right is where the Railroad Room is located. Now you'll see a crossbar and sign on the outside. Well, I want to personally thank two men, Treat and Dreet Younger. Now these men gave a lot of pieces to our collection here, along of course with a vast variety of other people that have donated many different items for our Railroad Room. As you enter the Railroad Room, you'll notice a baggage cart and baggage. Then also in front of you is a replica of what a ticket counter would look like in the days when you would actually be able to ride the railroad. At one time in this country, you could go just about anywhere you wanted to in the United States by riding on a train. We would also like to thank one of our sponsors, the Greenville and Western Railroad Company, for helping us and providing funds for our Railroad Room. Thomas Hart Benton made a painting basically about the Missouri and North Arkansas Railroad because a lot of people called it the May Never Arrive, and it was kind of a big joke. And right here is the lithograph he did in 1941. As we continue, we have a painting that actually at one time hung at the Chamber of Commerce in Harrison, and when they shut down and moved, they gave it to the museum. It's a very accurate description, pretty much. It is where the Harrison Station and a lot of the buildings and everything else were located, and it kind of gives you an idea of the railroad stations at that time. The M&A actually got its start as the Eureka Springs Railroad in 1880. And the reason it was started is a lot of people knew of Eureka Springs because people felt they could go to Eureka Springs for their health. And of course, the only way to get there originally was either by horseback or carriage or stagecoach, which, if you weren't feeling really well to start with, was probably a pretty rough ride. So doctors actually tied in with Frisco up there at Seligman, and they built the railroad down to Eureka Springs in 1882. For years, the city of Harrison tried to get the railroad to bring the line to Harrison because basically the city was pretty well, if you had to get any merchandise out, livestock or whatever going out of or coming in, you're looking at like going to Springfield or Fayetteville, maybe almost a 2-week trip. So with the railroad coming in, Harrison knew they could run things in and out in a day. I mean, it's just made so much sense. The city finally got the railroad to come, and it came in 1901. But they told the railroad if they could get here at a certain time, they would get $40,000. And at that time, that was a lot of money. So if you look at pictures, you will notice they were really trying to get here to meet the deadline. If you look at early pictures and look at the track, you'll notice that the ties are about 3 feet apart. So all they were interested in was just getting here. And then they went back later and redid the track. We have different artifacts and cases and different pictures of the different locomotives. And then we have a complete timeline of the railroad. Probably one of the biggest things that happened on this railroad and actually made national news was the strike from 1921 to 1923. Unfortunately, the strike ended when they lynched a man that was innocent of doing anything. So then they ran the unions out and the railroad went back into service. Then we have a complete timeline for the most part. The railroad between receiverships and different times that the tracks were washed out and they had a lot of different problems. We won't go into all that, but basically the railroad shut down for the most part in 1946. They did leave a section from Harrison back up to Seligman, but all the rest of it was scrapped and the whole railroad was scrapped out. And at the time when the railroad was scrapped out, it was the largest abandonment. Now, there have been some since then, but at that time, that was the largest abandonment of a railroad up until that time. And then, like I said, in 1960, the Harrison to Seligman route was shut down. The tracks were pulled up, and then there was a small section down to Cotton Plant, which is down towards the Mississippi River, and it finally quit operating in 1970. You'll notice here we have different other artifacts and cases full of artifacts. There are several books there. One of the books just came out. It's called The Mob Rule of the Ozarks, and it was about the strike from 1921 to 1923. Then a man named James Farr wrote a book, and it basically goes through the whole history of the railroad. The railroad was kind of a general freight line. They hauled at one time, like in Leslie, Arkansas, there was a giant cooperage down there. It was one of the largest in the world, actually, and they had their own cars and were bigger. They were bigger than boxcars, so they could get more barrels into them. So they had a fire, and that was pretty well the end of them. We have a table here of just some basic railroad tools. This one was used to hand move a car and has a big long handle on it. You could actually sit there and push a car along the tracks. These are picks and different bars and hammers and pins, just different things we have for the railroad. Now you see the heaters and the coolers, they were used in the caboose of the train. Now this right here is what the fireman or the engineer or whoever was going to oil along the outside of the engine would use. This is an oil can, and the reason he had the long spout on it is because there's actually oil spots along here, and they're deep inside there. So that's why they had them big long spouts. On the spouts on them, they could get back into the certain spots and put the oil there to keep it all running efficiently. Each railroad station had a telegraph operator, and each station had their own telegraph key. And if they wanted the train to stop, they would literally go out and turn this flag that you're looking at here at the station. They would turn it down. And then the engineer knew that they needed to stop at that particular station. Plus, they would have their orders from there. The conductor would have orders for like picking people up, letting people off, or picking up freight, or if there were cars to pick up or cars to let off. It was all done, though. It was all done by work and schedule, track work and schedule. Like the modern railroads now, they had lights and block signals and all that stuff. This is old-time railroad. Most of the railroad ties were not treated, so most of the rails in this railroad would weigh around 60 pounds, which is extremely light. And that's another reason why it had a lot of trouble with derailments. And if you look at it now, a Class 1 railroad in modern times, a yard of rail now weighs 136 pounds. So that's double what the rail weighed back then. There's something that most people do not realize, that is that railroads had standardized time. It was actually called Railroad Standard Time. A lot of people didn't know that, like in Harrison, when it's noon in Harrison, the people in Eureka Springs said it was 12:15. Well, as you well know, it's pretty hard to run a railroad without time. So they basically they set up with the advent of the telegraph, which basically runs at the speed of light. They could standardize time. They took the 4 time zones and said, this is how we're going to run time. If you don't want to accept it, that's fine, but this is what we're going to do. That's what the railroad said. So if you want to catch the train at noon, you better set your clock to our time. So basically, everybody came to have railroad time. And it was originally called Railroad Standard Time. And then every day they'd have big clocks, like the one you see here. Every day, usually at noon, the telegraph would go out and say, it's 12 noon. Over on the far wall here are different railroad lanterns. The bigger lanterns with the little hooks on them, these there on the bottom, actually went on the back of the caboose. Those are caboose lanterns. The other ones maybe were just normal lanterns to send out signals from. And if you'll look at this drawing here, it shows the different signals with the lanterns, and the brakeman would give the engineer what to do. You know, like at night when the engineer couldn't see. Over here on this wall we have pictures, and these are called maker plates. Now, these maker plates come from Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The pictures right here are the railroad shops in Harrison. They had steam shops, car shops, and the roadhouse. At one time, the only electricity in Harrison was the power plant that the railroad had. Well, the railroad itself, especially in steam days, was very labor intensive, and so you had a vast amount of people who kept going because of the railroad. And all along the line, you'd have what was called section gangs. These were groups of people that literally lived in a section of the track. A lot of them totally depended on the railroad, and it depended on how much work they had to keep up. A lot of them were like 10 miles apart. That's a section. A section was 10 miles. And they were responsible for that section, making sure all the spikes were in the rails and were in good shape. And then, if there was any type of derailment or anything, they were there working to help put it all back together. That's called maintenance right of way. If you wanted to go to Harrison or to Eureka Springs by stagecoach, we actually have a schedule that a good trip would take about 12 hours. But the railroad, you could probably get over there from Harrison to Eureka Springs in about 4 hours. But it always depended on how many stops they had to make along the way. One of the big things, almost every little town had a canning factory in it, and a lot of them were tomato canning factories. And also, I'm sure you're well aware of down at Marshall, Arkansas, they used to haul strawberries out of there by the carload when they were in season. There were strawberries, peaches, apples that were taken out of here by the railroad. Also down at Everton, there was a sand quarry down there, and at one time, the sand that came out of the quarry at Everton was some of the finest sand for making glass anywhere in the United States. The railroad, like I said, went into receivership, and I can't remember how many. It was about 3 or 4 times, mainly because of different economic conditions and, of course, the strike that happened in 22 and 23. And also, we have a bell here off of a Baldwin 260 or Consolidated or Mogul 26. It was a Mogul, and it's right here. And then once again, there's pictures of it, and then the oil cans for the steam locomotive. Of course, whenever you shipped anything, say you wanted to send something out by train, they had what they called freight scales. And then in the stations themselves, they had big floor scales, and they'd weigh it out, and everything was done by size and weight. And like I said, every station had their own identifying 3-digit code. And so they knew when they heard that 3-digit code that the transmission was coming to them, and everything that was done on the railroad was all done by telegraph. So the railroad told Bearville, Arkansas, that if they built their own rails up to the town and guaranteed them so much freight, they would service Bearville. The actual contract that they sent is all handwritten, which I found so amazing. Basically, everybody up and down the line depended on the railroad for a lot of their everyday needs. If you needed parts for something, or a plow, salt, sugar, all of this, it all came by rail, and so it was in every community. There was no trucking, but there was the railroad.